In the autumn of 1449, the English soldiers garrisoned across Normandy believed they held the safest ground in Europe. Their walls were stone, 30 feet high in places, raised by masons whose grandfathers had raised walls before them, and for 300 years, walls like these had done exactly what walls were built to do. A well-stocked fortress was expected to hold for months. Some had held for years. Then the army of Charles VII of France arrived outside the port town of Harfleur, dragging behind it something no English garrison had ever faced at full strength. And Harfleur, a fortress that had once cost an English king a 5-week siege and a third of his army to take, surrendered in 17 days. It was not an exception. Over the following months, the chroniclers of the campaign recorded English strongholds falling at a pace no one alive had ever witnessed, some in a week, some in days, some after a single morning of bombardment. By the summer of 1450, English Normandy had simply ceased to exist. Every castle in Europe was now, in a strictly practical sense, obsolete. And yet within 50 years of that campaign, engineers in Italy produced an answer. Not a bigger wall, not a thicker gate, a shape. A low, angled, geometric shape that swallowed cannon fire and turned every approach into a killing ground. A design so difficult to defeat that the greatest empires of the next 4 centuries bankrupted themselves against it, poured entire armies into the mud in front of it, and spent generation after generation searching for a way to erase it from the map. One siege against this design lasted 3 years and consumed, by most estimates, more than 100,000 lives over a single town. So the question this video answers is simple. How did a shape hold off the most powerful weapons on Earth for 400 years? And what, in the end, finally killed it? Here is exactly what this story will cover. First, the 2 French brothers whose gun train broke roughly 60 fortified places in around a year, and the afternoon in 1453 when their cannon killed the most famous English soldier alive. Second, the precise geometric flaw built into every medieval castle in Europe, a blind spot at the foot of every round tower that no amount of stone could fix. Third, the desperate improvisation at the city of Pisa in 1500, where citizens working through the night built something behind their breached wall that stopped a Franco-Florentine army cold, and why the popular story about where this design came from gets the origin wrong. Fourth, the Siege of Ostend, the 3-year meat grinder that showed Europe what the new fortresses truly cost, and what the Spanish army actually received when the town finally fell. And fifth, the single technological change of the 1860s that accomplished in about 30 hours what 4 centuries of armies could not, along with the places where you can still stand inside this design today and see the geometry working with your own eyes. What follows is drawn from siege records, the treatises of the military engineers themselves, and the work of modern historians of the period, and where the numbers are disputed, I will tell you so. The story begins not with a fortress, but with the men who made fortresses worthless. Jean Bureau was not a nobleman. He was a Parisian administrator, a man of accounts and logistics, trained in the law courts and the counting house, and together with his brother Gaspard, he built for the French crown something Europe had never seen before: a permanent, professional, superbly organized artillery train. Cannon had existed for a century by then, but they had been slow, unreliable, prestige objects as much as weapons, dragged to sieges in 1s and 2s and fired a few times a day, as likely to burst and kill their own crews as to damage a wall. The Bureau brothers changed the arithmetic on every line of the ledger. They benefited from a quiet revolution in the powder itself, the shift to what gunners called corned powder. gunpowder milled into uniform granules rather than loose dust, which burned faster and more predictably, and delivered far more force per pound. They took advantage of improved casting that allowed longer, stronger barrels firing dense iron shot instead of stone balls, iron that concentrated the same weight into a smaller, harder, faster projectile. And around this improved hardware they built organization, standardized calibers so shot could be supplied in bulk, dedicated professional crews instead of hired contractors, mobile forges for repairs in the field, and the carts, oxen, pontoons, and pioneers that kept the whole machine moving down the muddy roads of Normandy at campaign speed. When the truce between France and England collapsed in 1449, this machine rolled north, and the results read less like a war than like a demolition schedule. The fortress of Pont-Audemer fell, then Lisieux, then Mantes and Vernon. Rouen, the capital of English Normandy, a city ringed with serious fortifications and defended by Talbot himself, capitulated in October of 1449 after the guns arrived and the population saw what was coming. The citizens effectively forced the garrison's hand rather than endure a bombardment they knew the walls could not survive. Harfleur, as we have seen, lasted 17 days in a winter siege, the same Harfleur that in 1415 had cost Henry V 5 weeks and, through dysentery and casualties, roughly a third of the army he had brought to France. Harfleur followed in weeks. The chroniclers of the campaign counted roughly 60 castles and fortified towns reduced in about a year, a figure repeated with astonishment in the French records, because a single one of those sieges would have been a respectable achievement for an entire campaigning season a generation earlier. The arithmetic of the Reconquest works out to a fortified place falling on average every 6 days. In April of 1450, an English relief army of perhaps 4,000 men was destroyed at Formigny, a battle opened fittingly by 2 French field guns, light culverins that raked the English line from beyond bow range until the archers, unable to endure it, charged out of their prepared position to capture the guns, and were caught in the open when Breton cavalry arrived on their flank. In August, Cherbourg, the last English fortress in Normandy, surrendered, with Bureau's guns famously planted on the tidal flats and left to fire even as the sea came in over them, the crews waterproofing the pieces and returning at low tide. 3 years later, the same story repeated in Gascony, and at Castillon in July of 1453, John Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, the most celebrated English commander of his age, a man of roughly 70 who had fought the French for half a century, led a frontal attack on Jean Bureau's fortified artillery park, an entrenched camp bristling with as many as 300 guns of every size. Talbot, bound by the terms of an earlier parole not to wear armor against the French crown, rode into that fire in a purple gown and was pinned when his horse was killed under him by a cannonball, and the old man was cut down where he fell. English France was finished. And every ruler in Europe who could read a dispatch understood what the Bureau brothers had demonstrated. The high stone wall, the instrument that had organized European warfare, land ownership, and political power for half a millennium, no longer worked. That same decade, at the other end of the continent, the enormous bombards of the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II battered down the Theodosian walls of Constantinople, walls that had defeated sieges for 1,000 years. The largest of those guns, cast by the Hungarian engineer Orban after the Byzantines could not afford his asking price, was reported at some 27 feet long, threw a stone ball of over 1,000 pounds, and required teams of dozens of oxen to move. It could fire only a handful of times a day, but after 6 weeks of bombardment, the greatest fortification system in the ancient world had gaps in it. And on the 29th of May, 1453, the city fell. The lesson was continental, delivered at both ends of Europe in the same year. What no one yet knew was what could possibly replace the wall. To understand the answer, you have to understand exactly why the old walls failed. Because the failure was not simply that cannon were powerful, it was geometric, and it had two parts. The first part was the wall itself. A medieval curtain wall was built high and relatively thin, often 10 feet thick or less, because its designers were defeating ladders, siege towers, and the human body. Height was the entire point. Height defeated escalade. Height gave defenders the range advantage. Height let them drop projectiles on anyone working at the base. But to gunpowder artillery firing iron shot on a flat trajectory, a high, thin wall is not an obstacle. It is a target. The physics is unforgiving. Stone and mortar are brittle materials, immensely strong under compression but weak in tension. And a cannonball arriving at several hundred feet per second does not push on a wall, it shocks it, sending fracture lines racing through the masonry far beyond the point of impact. Rigid stone does not flex under impact, it cracks. And repeated hits in a horizontal line, what gunners called battering in breach, caused whole sections of wall to shear along that line and collapse into a climbable ramp of rubble, conveniently deposited in the ditch the attackers needed to cross anyway. The taller the wall, the more of it there was to hit, and the harder it fell. The second part of the failure is less obvious, and it is the detail that most retellings of this story skip. Every tower on a medieval castle was a source of blind ground. A round tower, for all its strength against the mine and the ram, has a curved face, and there is a wedge of earth directly at its base that no defender on that tower or on the adjacent walls can see or shoot into without leaning fatally over the parapet. Attackers had exploited this for centuries. It is where miners dug and where rams worked, which is why castle builders had resorted to machicolations, those overhanging galleries with holes in the floor to drop things straight down into ground they could not otherwise reach. The old system had always compensated with height, dropping stones and boiling liquids from above. Once cannon removed the height, the blind ground remained, and nothing compensated for anything. So the Italian engineers of the late 1400s, working in the most fought-over and most mathematically literate region of Europe, a peninsula where French, Spanish, and imperial armies collided for decades after Charles VIII's invasion of 1494 brought a modern siege train over the Alps, attacked both problems at once. Their answer had three components. First, bring the wall down and thicken it. A low profile presents almost nothing to a flat trajectory gun, and the mature designs went further, sinking the whole fortress behind a broad, sloped apron of earth called a glacis, graded at precisely the angle that meant an attacker's shot either buried itself in the slope or skipped harmlessly over the top of the defenses. From ground level, a finished bastion fortress was almost invisible. An approaching army saw not ramparts, but a gentle, grassy rise with nothing to shoot at. Second, and this is the crucial insight, back the wall with earth, or face an earthen rampart with brick, because packed soil does not shatter the way stone does. Earth has no fracture lines to propagate. A cannonball that would crack ashlar masonry simply buries itself a few feet into compacted soil, spending its energy on nothing, and the defenders could shovel the damage closed overnight. The fortress stopped resisting the shot and started absorbing it. Ramparts now 40, 60, even 80 feet thick at the base. Third, solve the blind ground with geometry. Replace the round tower with the angled bastion, a four-sided, arrowhead-shaped platform projecting from the wall, its flat faces and recessed flanks laid out along calculated lines of fire, so that the guns on each bastion swept the entire face of its neighbors and the full length of the curtain wall between them. Every flank was positioned to fire along the wall rather than out from it, so that an assault party pressed against the rampart exactly where medieval defenders could not touch them now stood in a shooting gallery raked from the side at close range by guns loaded with case shot, tin cans of musket balls that turned a cannon into a giant shotgun. Trace those lines around a whole town. Add triangular outworks called ravelins to shield the curtains, and a covered walkway around the ditch for infantry, and you get the star-shaped plan the design is famous for. But the star was never decoration. Every point of the star exists so that no attacker anywhere on the perimeter can stand in ground that is not covered by at least one line of defensive fire, and usually two. There was no longer anywhere to hide a ram, a minehead, or a storming party. Historians came to call the system the trace italienne, the Italian outline. Set the Bureau brothers' magnificent gun train down in front of a mature example of it, and their guns would batter the low earthen faces for weeks and achieve very close to nothing. The weapon that had erased the castle had itself been answered, and the answer would define warfare for 400 years. Now, the popular version of this story says the bastion system was invented on drafting tables, a triumph of Renaissance genius delivered fully formed by architects like Leonardo and the Sangallo family. And it is true that the great names circled the problem. Leonardo da Vinci sketched low, rounded, artillery-resistant fortifications and served the Borgia armies as an engineer. And Michelangelo himself directed the fortification of Florence's hills in 1529. But the reality was messier, and the clearest proof comes from Pisa in the year 1500. Pisa was in revolt against Florence, and a combined Florentine and French force arrived with a siege train that duly did what siege trains now did. It smashed a breach in Pisa's medieval wall. By every rule of the new warfare, the city was finished. But the Pisans, working with soil, timber, and thousands of civilian hands, men, women, and by some accounts, children carrying baskets of earth through the night, had thrown up a second barrier behind the threatened section, what Italian engineers would come to call a retirata, a wide-sloped rampart of packed earth with a ditch in front of it set back from the wall so that attackers pouring through the breach would find themselves in a low pocket of ground staring up at a fresh earthen face lined with defenders, caught between the rubble behind them and the new rampart ahead. The assault went in, reached the rubble of the breach, saw what waited behind it, and broke. The siege failed, and Pisa, a middling city defying the wealth of Florence and the arms of France, held out for another 9 years and was finally reduced not by cannon, but by blockade and starvation. The historian Francesco Guicciardini recorded the episode, and Niccolò Machiavelli, who served the Florentine government during those wars, inspected such works himself and was sent repeatedly to the camps before Pisa, wrote afterward, in his Art of War and his reports, about the striking power of earthen ramparts against artillery, observing that the double Pisan rampart had done what stone could not. The professional engineers took the lesson and formalized it. Within a generation, purpose-built angled bastions in brick and earth were rising around Italian cities, with the fortifications the Sangallo family built for the Papal States at Civitavecchia and Nettuno, and eventually Rome itself, among the earliest complete examples, Antonio da Sangallo the Younger running what amounted to the first specialized fortification design firm in Europe, and the Venetian engineer Michele San Michele refining the form in the ramparts of Verona in the 1530s. So the origin was not a stroke of studio genius. It was a desperate improvisation by a besieged population, observed, measured, and turned into mathematics. That is the first example, the design proving itself at birth. The second comes from Malta in 1565, and it shows what even a small, doomed work of the new style could cost an attacker. When the Ottoman Empire landed some 30,000 to 40,000 men to take the island from the Knights of St. John, their commanders, Mustafa Pasha commanding the army and Piale Pasha the fleet, identified Fort St. Elmo, a small star-shaped fort of just a few hundred defenders guarding the harbor mouth, as the first objective, and their engineers reportedly judged it would fall within days. It held for around 4 weeks under one of the heaviest bombardments of the century, tens of thousands of rounds by contemporary estimate, the Knights ferrying replacements across the harbor by night to replace the dead. The garrison died almost to the last man, the final assault overrunning wounded knights who had themselves carried to chairs at the breach. But the fort's low-angled profile and interlocking fire made every assault a massacre in the ditch, and by the time St. Elmo fell, the Ottomans had, by most accounts, lost several thousand of their best troops, including the Janissary elite and the legendary Corsair commander Dragut, the 80-year-old terror of the Mediterranean, mortally wounded by a stone splinter during the siege. Mustafa Pasha, looking from the ruins of St. Elmo across the harbor at the far larger Fort St. Angelo, is said to have remarked, "If so small a son has cost us so dear, what price must we pay for the father?" The attackers had spent a month of their campaigning season and a substantial share of their army on the smallest fort in the harbor. And when a Spanish relief force landed in September, the exhausted Ottoman army withdrew. The great siege of Malta ultimately failed. The third example is the one the 17th century never forgot: Ostend. In 1601, the Spanish army of Flanders, then among the most professional fighting forces on earth, laid siege to the Dutch-held port of Ostend, a town ringed with earthen bastions, ditches, and outworks in the mature Italian style, and kept resupplied by sea, which meant the defenders could do something no medieval garrison could dream of: rotate fresh troops in and exhausted ones out, indefinitely. Contemporaries called it the New Troy. The Archduke Albert, governing the Spanish Netherlands, opened the siege believing it a matter of months. In January of 1602, he launched a general assault across the tidal flats that was shattered with losses in the thousands in a single night. The Dutch, by some accounts, opening a sluice to drown the attackers in the ditch. The siege lasted 3 years and needed the greatest siege engineer of the age, Ambrogio Spinola, a Genoese banker's son who took command in 1603 and financed operations partly from his own family fortune to finish it, sapping forward yard by yard through ground that was as much seawater as soil. Contemporaries and modern historians put the combined losses of both sides at somewhere beyond 100,000 men, dead of shot, mine blasts, disease, and the grinding assault of trench against rampart, all over a single town of modest size. A figure that, even allowing for the uncertainty of early modern casualty counts, exceeds the dead of most of the era's famous battles combined. When Ostend finally surrendered in September of 1604, the Spanish marched into a place that no longer meaningfully existed, a field of pulverized earthworks and rubble where the defenders had fallen back from one improvised rampart to the next until there was nothing left to stand behind. A contemporary quip held that Spain had spent 3 years and an army to purchase a heap of ruins. That is the answer to the loop I opened at the start. What the empire received for 100,000 lives was wreckage, and every treasury in Europe took note. Which brings us to the heart of the matter. The reason this design deserves to be called a weapon that armies tried to erase. Because its effects reached far beyond any single siege. Count them with me. 1. The bastion fortress made war slow. Before 1450, a decisive battle could deliver a province in an afternoon. After the Trace Italienne spread, a victorious army marching into enemy territory simply ran aground on the nearest fortress belt, because no commander could bypass a garrisoned star fort and leave it sitting on his supply lines, free to send raiding parties against every wagon convoy that fed his army. Campaigns that might have been settled in a season stretched into decades of siege after siege. The 80 Years' War between Spain and the Dutch is, in large part, the history of armies grinding through exactly such a belt, and it is no accident that the war lasted from 1568 to 1648, twice the length of any medieval Anglo-French war of conquest. Battles still happened, but they decided less. The fortresses were the currency. 2. It made armies enormous. Besieging a bastioned town required not only a large assault force, but a second army's worth of men to dig the trenches, guard the perimeter against relief, and hold every fortress already taken, each garrison a permanent deduction from field strength. Historians such as Geoffrey Parker, whose work on the military revolution made the Trace Italienne famous among academics, have argued that this demand was a driving engine of the growth of European armies, Spain's forces swelling toward 150,000 men under Philip II, France's toward 400,000 under Louis XIV, an order of magnitude leap in a century and a half, with everything that implied for taxation, conscription, and the reach of the state into ordinary lives. 3. It made war a branch of mathematics. Attacking a star fort scientifically meant geometry, and by the late 1600s, the French engineer Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban had reduced the process to a near timetable. The zigzag approach, trenches angled so no defender could fire down their length, the 3 parallels, great arcs of trench dug successively closer to the fortress, a system he unveiled at the siege of Maastricht in 1673. The ricochet batteries, whose shots were fired at low charge to bounce along the ramparts, dismounting gun after gun. Then the breach and the honorable surrender, often predicted almost to the day. Engineers spoke of a properly conducted siege as a matter of some 40-odd days from first trench to capitulation. Vauban directed dozens of successful sieges. The traditional count runs to around 50, without a single failure, and built or remade some 160 fortresses across France's frontiers, arranging them into his prés carrés, a double belt of mutually supporting strongholds along the northern border. His century coined the saying that a town besieged by Vauban was a town taken, and a town defended by Vauban was a town saved. And his systems were studied like scripture in every military academy in Europe for 150 years after his death. 4. It helped build the modern state itself. Fortresses of this scale, and the standing armies needed to attack or hold them, could not be paid for by feudal dues. They demanded permanent taxation, central treasuries, professional bureaucracies, long-term public debt. The citadel of Antwerp, a single 5-bastioned work begun in 1567, is estimated to have cost well over 1 million florins, an almost unthinkable sum, more than the annual revenue of many kingdoms, and states restructured themselves to afford such things. The fiscal machinery invented to fund fortresses and garrisons became, in time, the machinery of the modern government. 5. It froze the map. Fortress belts along the frontiers of the Low Countries, northern Italy, and the Rhine made borders in those regions extraordinarily durable, because moving a frontier now meant reducing a chain of star forts one by one at Ostend prices, and the borders those belts defended in the 17th century correspond, in stretches, to national borders that exist today. For 4 centuries, from the Italian Wars to the age of Napoleon, this shape sat at the center of European warfare, and every army that marched found itself sooner or later digging in the mud in front of one. Even Napoleon, the great apostle of the decisive battle, had his campaigns bled by sieges from Acre, where a wretched coastal fortification stopped him outright, to the Spanish fortress towns that swallowed years of his army's strength. That is what it means to say they tried to erase it. They tried with mines, with massed batteries, with starvation, with mathematics, and the shape held. And then, in about 30 hours, it died. The killer was not a bigger army or a cleverer engineer. It was a change in the gun itself. Through the 1850s and 60s, artillery converted from smoothbore barrels firing round balls to rifled barrels firing elongated, spin-stabilized shells, and the difference was not incremental. A rifled barrel's spiral grooves spun the projectile like a thrown football, which meant it could be long instead of round, carrying 2 or 3 times the mass for the same caliber, holding its velocity and its accuracy over several times the distance, and arriving point first so that its energy drilled into the target instead of slapping against it. The demonstration came in April of 1862, during the American Civil War, at Fort Pulaski in Georgia, a massive brick fortress at the mouth of the Savannah River, 25 million bricks, walls 7.5 feet thick, considered effectively invulnerable at existing artillery ranges. The chief engineer of the United States Army, Joseph Totten, had declared that one might as well bombard the Rocky Mountains, and a young lieutenant named Robert E. Lee, who had helped build the place, told its garrison that guns on Tybee Island could never breach it. Union batteries on Tybee, commanded by an engineer captain named Quincy Gilmore, sat over a mile away, roughly 1,700 yards, a distance at which smoothbore fire would have been nearly harmless, and Gilmore had quietly included 10 new rifled guns among his 36 pieces. They opened on the morning of April 10th, and the rifled shells did not bounce off the brick. They bored into it, each round gnawing the same corner of the southeast face. By noon on April 11th, roughly 30 hours later, the wall was open, and shells were passing clean through the breach across the parade ground toward the main powder magazine, which held 40,000 pounds of gunpowder. Colonel Charles Olmsted surrendered that afternoon, having lost almost no men, because the alternative was annihilation by his own magazine. Every engineer who read the report understood that 400 years of fortress design had just ended, and within a generation, the great powers stopped building star forts entirely, shifting to dispersed, buried concrete and steel works, and eventually abandoning fixed masonry fortification altogether. But here is the detail worth carrying away. The geometry never actually died. Only the masonry did. 20th century fieldworks, artillery fire bases, and modern military positions still obey the same 3 commandments written at Pisa and Verona. Keep a low profile, let earth absorb what armor cannot, and lay out your defenses so that every approach is covered by interlocking fire from a neighboring position. A First World War trench system with its low silhouette, its earthen parapets, and its machine guns sighted to fire across each other's fronts rather than straight ahead is the Trace Italienne redrawn in barbed wire. And if you want to see the original, it survives, because the design's final irony is that it was too expensive to demolish. The fortress town of Palmanova in northern Italy, begun by Venice in 1593 as a perfect nine-pointed star with a whole town inside it, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, can still be entered through its original gates. Naarden in the Netherlands sits intact inside its double ring of bastions and water. Bourtange in the Dutch northeast has been restored so completely that from the air it looks like a diagram out of Vauban's own notebooks. Stand on a bastion flank at any of them, sight down the face of the neighboring bastion, and you will see with your own eyes that there is nowhere in front of you to hide. 4.5 centuries later, the geometry still works, so consider the full arc of what happened here. In 1450, Jean and Gaspard Bureau proved that the wall, the technology that had structured European power since Rome fell, was finished, 60 fortresses in about a year. Within 2 generations, a shape improvised by the desperate citizens of Pisa and perfected by Italian mathematics had not only answered the cannon, but had taken warfare hostage, swelling armies, bankrolling the modern state, and making a single stubborn town like Ostend worth 3 years and 100,000 lives. And the design was never truly beaten by any of the armies that tried. It was outlived, retired in a day and a half at Fort Pulaski by a new kind of gun, only to pass its logic quietly into every fortified position built since. Military history remembers the battles, the charges, the afternoon victories, but for 400 years, the real decisions of European war were made slowly, in the flooded trenches in front of a low earthen wall, by a shape most people today have never heard named. This channel exists for exactly these stories, the systems and decisions underneath the famous dates, and there are many more to tell, from the deception campaigns of the American Revolution to the siege engineers of the Mongol Empire. If this one earned your time, a like helps more people find it, and subscribing means you will be here when the next file opens. I will see you inside the next one.